I dedicated my life to supporting my sister, working 2 jobs to pay for her prestigious education. But then she turned on me and called me a loser. I've never thought of myself as a complainer. Life throws punches, and I've always been the type to roll with them. But lately, it feels like I've been standing in the middle of a boxing ring, with no gloves and no one in my corner. It all started with Megan, my younger sister. She's always been the golden child, bright, ambitious, full of potential. When she got into one of the most prestigious universities in the country, the whole family celebrated like we'd won the lottery. But the excitement didn't last long for me. Reality hit when my parents, Lisa and Mark, made it clear that the financial burden of Megan's education would fall squarely on my shoulders. Family supports family, they said, as if that phrase could magically stretch my bank account. I work 2 jobs, days at a construction site and nights at a warehouse. The pay is just enough to cover my modest rent and Megan's tuition, books, and living expenses. I've sacrificed weekends, sleep, and any semblance of a social life to make sure she has what she needs. Or, at least, what I thought she needed. At first, I told myself it was worth it. Megan was going to make something of herself, and helping her achieve that felt like the right thing to do. But then I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It began with her social media posts. She'd upload pictures of herself wearing designer clothes, sipping overpriced cocktails at fancy bars, and posing at lavish parties. Each post felt like a slap in the face. I brushed it off at first, telling myself she was just blowing off steam. College is stressful, right? But then the photos became more frequent, and her captions, things like, work hard, play harder, or, living my best life, started to sting. One day, I checked my bank account after wiring her the usual monthly amount. I was down to barely enough to cover my rent. Meanwhile, Megan had posted a picture of herself in a high-end boutique, holding several shopping bags, with a caption that read, "Retail therapy done right." I couldn't believe it. All the late shifts, the aching back, the endless grind, it was funding her therapy. The worst part was her attitude. When I brought it up during one of our rare conversations, she brushed me off like I was overreacting. She'd laugh and say things like, "Oh, Alex, you worry too much," or "I'll pay you back when I'm successful." It wasn't just her words, it was the tone, the casual indifference that cut deeper than I'd expected. My parents weren't any better. Whenever I tried to voice my concerns, they'd guilt-trip me into silence. "Do you want Megan to fail? Do you want her to struggle like you did?" It was as if my struggles were a rite of passage, something to be endured so Megan wouldn't have to. They'd always been good at that, manipulating me with their family values speeches, making me feel like a villain for even thinking about myself. One night, after an especially grueling shift, I found myself scrolling through Megan's feed again. Another party, another caption about how amazing her life was. My chest tightened. It wasn't just anger, it was something heavier. Resentment, maybe. I'd given up so much for her, and it felt like she didn't even see it. Or worse, that she saw it and didn't care. That's when I decided to dig a little deeper. I went through her posts more carefully, paying attention to the little details I'd ignored before. The venues she tagged, the brands she flaunted, the people she was with. It all painted a picture I couldn't ignore anymore. Megan wasn't just enjoying herself, she was living a lifestyle I could only dream of, all while I was breaking my back to make it happen. The tipping point came when I found out she'd booked a spring break trip to Europe. She hadn't mentioned it to me, of course. I saw it in an Instagram story, her flight itinerary, followed by a boomerang of her suitcase filled with designer outfits. The caption read, "Can't wait to explore Europe. #blessed. Blessed. That word echoed in my mind, mocking me. Blessed by what? My sleepless nights? My aching joints? My complete lack of a life outside work? For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just angry, I was done. Done being the family's ATM, done sacrificing everything for someone who clearly didn't value it. Something had to change, and it had to change now. Family dinners used to be a rare moment of peace for me. They were one of the few times I could sit down without thinking about my endless responsibilities. But this one felt like a battlefield even before the first course was served. I'd barely taken my seat when Megan dropped her latest bombshell. She'd been accepted into a study abroad program, some prestigious opportunity that involved a semester in Paris. The way she described it, you'd think she'd already packed her bags. She rattled off details about the courses, the housing, the cultural experiences. Everyone at the table looked impressed. Everyone except me. I knew what was coming before she even said it. Megan turned to me with that same breezy confidence she'd always had. She didn't ask if I could afford it or even if I wanted to help. She just assumed. In her mind, my willingness to bankroll her life was as automatic as sunrise. It wasn't even the request itself that broke me. It was her tone, the casual way she threw it out there like it was my duty. When I didn't respond immediately, she laughed and said something about how family always comes through. That phrase had been the leash around my neck for years, and I felt it tightening again. I shook my head, trying to stay calm. But when I said I couldn't do it, the mood at the table shifted. Megan didn't just look surprised, she looked offended. Like I'd told her the sky wasn't blue. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and stared at me like I was some kind of failure. The words that came out of her mouth next were like a punch to the gut. She called me a loser. Not directly, but the message was clear. She said something about how people with ambition don't just stop trying, and how it was sad that I couldn't handle a little extra responsibility. The room went dead silent. Even my parents looked uncomfortable, though not for long. Lisa was the first to speak, throwing her full weight behind Megan. She started with the usual guilt tactics, reminding me of everything they'd done for me growing up, as if that erased the mountain of debt and exhaustion I was buried under now. Mark chimed in next, asking how I could be so cruel to my sister, who was just trying to better herself. I snapped. Years of bottled-up frustration spilled out all at once. I told them exactly how I felt about being their financial safety net, about the sacrifices I'd made and how little they seemed to care. I laid it all out, the sleepless nights, the 2 jobs, the complete lack of a life outside work. I told them how unfair it was that I was expected to shoulder all of this alone. Megan's reaction was the worst. Instead of understanding or even empathy, she doubled down. She accused me of being selfish, of only caring about myself. She said I was jealous of her success and that I didn't want her to have opportunities because I couldn't have them. My parents didn't hold back either. They called me ungrateful, cold-hearted, and a disappointment to the family. Every word felt like another weight added to my shoulders, pushing me closer to the breaking point. But then something inside me snapped. For the first time, I said what I'd been too scared to say for years. I told them I was done. Done paying for Megan's education. Done sacrificing my life for people who clearly didn't value it. I told them they could figure out how to support her themselves because I wasn't doing it anymore. The room exploded. Lisa and Mark shouted over each other, throwing accusations and guilt trips my way. Megan sat there stunned, her face pale as the reality of my words sank in. She started to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked out of the house without another word. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it felt good. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with the fallout of what I'd just done. But beneath the chaos, there was something else, relief. For the first time, I'd put myself first, and it felt like a victory, even if it came at a cost. As I walked away, I could still hear their voices echoing in my head, but I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I'd made my choice, and whatever came next, I knew I'd face it on my own terms. The fallout from that family dinner was swift and relentless. My phone turned into a war zone of missed calls and messages. Megan, my parents, even extended family members, everyone was taking their turn trying to break me down. At first, I ignored it. I thought they'd get the message eventually, that they'd realize I wasn't going to budge. But the calls kept coming, each one angrier and more desperate than the last. Megan's messages were the worst. She started with guilt, reminding me of all the times I'd told her I'd always be there for her. When that didn't work, she switched to anger, accusing me of being selfish and ruining her future. Her desperation seeped into her words, and soon her messages turned into a barrage of pleas. She said she couldn't make rent, that she was weeks away from being evicted. But I held firm. I wasn't going to be manipulated again. My parents weren't any better. Lisa's texts were full of emotional blackmail, painting me as the villain who'd abandoned the family in their time of need. Mark took a different approach, leaning on his disappointment in me and how I'd failed as a brother. It was almost laughable, the way they twisted the narrative to make themselves the victims. Almost. I'd spent years bending over backward to meet their expectations, sacrificing everything for a family that took my efforts for granted. But this time, I wasn't going to let them guilt me into submission. I'd made my decision, and I was determined to stick to it. A week later, Megan showed up at my apartment. I opened the door to find her standing there, mascara streaked down her face, tears flowing freely. She looked like a different person, vulnerable, broken. It was a side of her I'd never seen before, and for a moment, I almost caved. Almost. She launched into a frantic explanation, her words tumbling over each other as she described how she'd fallen behind on rent and how her landlord was threatening to evict her. She begged me to help, just this once, promising she'd pay me back. But I knew better. Promises like that were easy to make when you're desperate, and even easier to forget when the crisis passes. I told her no. It wasn't an easy thing to say, and it definitely wasn't easy to watch the pain flash across her face. But I'd spent too many years prioritizing her needs over my own, and I couldn't do it anymore. I reminded her that she'd made her own choices, that she'd decided to live beyond her means, and that it wasn't my responsibility to bail her out. Her reaction was immediate and intense. She accused me of abandoning her, of turning my back on family. She said things that were meant to hurt, and I'd be lying if I said they didn't. But I stood my ground. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life, and I wasn't going to let her guilt me into giving that up. Eventually, she left. I watched her walk away, her shoulders hunched, her sobs echoing down the hallway. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I knew it was the right decision. Megan needed to learn how to take responsibility for her actions, and I needed to learn how to stop being everyone else's safety net. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. For years, I'd been so focused on helping Megan and meeting my parents' expectations that I'd completely neglected my own needs. I'd let their guilt trips and emotional manipulation dictate my life, and it had cost me more than I'd realized. But now, things were different. I'd drawn a line in the sand, and I was determined to stick to it. My priority wasn't Megan's rent or her study abroad dreams anymore. It was me. My life, my goals, my happiness. I'd spent too long putting everyone else first, and it was time for that to change. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Megan would probably struggle, and my parents would likely never forgive me. But I couldn't let that stop me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my own destiny, and that was worth any fallout I might face. As I sat there, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness for what I'd lost, anger at how I'd been treated, but also a spark of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could finally start building the life I'd always wanted. And for the first time, that thought didn't feel selfish. It felt like freedom. Megan's return to our parents' home was like throwing a lit match into a pile of dry leaves. At first, Lisa and Mark seemed relieved to have her back. They spun it as an opportunity to rebuild the family and get back on track. But the reality of Megan's presence soon spilled out, not through first-hand experience, but through the gossip that filtered back to me via our Aunt Carol. Carol called one evening, her tone a mix of concern and curiosity. She'd heard from Lisa that things at home weren't going well. Megan, it seemed, was struggling to adjust to life without the luxuries she'd grown accustomed to. According to Carol, Megan had clashed with Lisa and Mark over everything from household chores to the lack of understanding they showed her. Carol didn't hold back. She described how Megan complained about the outdated furniture, the lack of privacy, and how she wasn't used to contributing to basic tasks. These frustrations apparently led to frequent arguments, with Megan accusing Lisa and Mark of failing her. Lisa, in turn, had confided in Carol about her growing frustration with Megan's entitlement, something she'd once excused but now couldn't ignore. Even Mark, usually the quieter parent, had lost his patience, retreating from conversations altogether to avoid the constant tension. As Carol painted this picture of chaos, I couldn't help but feel a bitter mix of vindication and sadness. It seemed the golden child was finally facing some consequences, though not without blaming everyone around her first. Carol's recounting made it clear that the harmonious family front Lisa and Mark liked to project was falling apart. Then came the twist. Carol told me Lisa was blaming me for it all. Lisa had apparently told her that my refusal to support Megan had crushed the family's unity and thrown their lives into disarray. Carol's tone shifted when she relayed this part, as if she was fishing for my side of the story. I explained my perspective as calmly as I could, but it was clear Carol had already heard enough from Lisa to form her own opinion. In the days that followed, the gossip spread. Other relatives started calling, their messages laced with judgment. Some were subtle, offering advice cloaked in concern, while others outright accused me of abandoning my responsibilities. Each call felt like another dagger, twisting the narrative further away from the truth. Megan, meanwhile, wasn't helping her case. Carol mentioned that even with all the conflict at home, Megan was still finding time to post passive-aggressive updates on social media. Cryptic messages about betrayal and some people showing their true colors were her new theme, painting herself as the victim of a cold-hearted sibling. Despite their anger, Lisa and Mark were now stuck with Megan's financial burden. Carol hinted that they'd underestimated how unprepared she was to fend for herself. Without a job or any income, Megan's demands were straining them in ways they hadn't anticipated. While part of me felt vindicated, it was hard to take any real satisfaction from their struggles. Watching my family implode, even from the sidelines, wasn't what I'd wanted. One night, Lisa called me directly. Her voice was sharp, her words cutting. She demanded to know how I could sleep at night, knowing the chaos I'd caused. I told her the truth, that I was finally sleeping better than I had in years. It wasn't the answer she wanted, and the call ended with her shouting something about how I'd regret my actions someday. But I didn't regret them. For the first time, I was living life on my own terms. It wasn't perfect, and it definitely wasn't easy, but it was mine. The backlash from my family was painful, but it also felt like a necessary step toward breaking free from their control. I wasn't their safety net anymore, and that realization brought a sense of relief I hadn't expected. Still, the weight of their judgment lingered. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for another confrontation. Every holiday or family gathering felt like a landmine, waiting to explode. But I reminded myself why I'd made the choice in the first place. Megan needed to grow up, and Lisa and Mark needed to stop enabling her. And I needed to stop setting myself on fire to keep them warm. The family ties were fraying, unraveling into something unrecognizable. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped by them. I felt free to focus on myself, even if it meant walking away from the people who should have been my strongest support system. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was the one I could live with. The knock on my door late that evening was unexpected, but the sight of Lisa and Mark standing there was even more so. They weren't the kind of people to show up unannounced, which told me this wasn't a casual visit. Their faces were tight with unease, and Lisa's hand clutched a worn envelope as if it were a lifeline. Without preamble, they started explaining. Megan had racked up significant credit card debt. The amounts were staggering, far beyond what I'd imagined. Designer clothes, luxury dinners, trips she hadn't even mentioned on social media, it had all spiraled out of control. Lisa's voice cracked as she admitted they couldn't keep up. They'd maxed out their own resources trying to cover for her, and now they were here, standing in my doorway, asking for my help. For a moment, I just stared at them. The words hung in the air, heavy and surreal. This was the culmination of everything I'd warned them about, the inevitable fallout from their constant enabling. I'd seen it coming, but now that it was here, I felt no satisfaction. Only exhaustion. I told them no. I didn't raise my voice or slam the door, I just said it plainly. No, I wouldn't pay Megan's debts. No, I wouldn't dig them out of the hole they'd willingly stepped into. Lisa's eyes widened in disbelief, while Mark's jaw tightened in silent anger. They'd expected resistance, perhaps even some hesitation, but not this calm certainty. Lisa's voice rose as she tried to sway me. She brought up the usual arguments about family, responsibility, and how we're supposed to stick together. Mark chimed in, his tone colder, accusing me of being heartless and selfish. But their words didn't cut the way they used to. I'd spent years letting their guilt trips dictate my actions, but now I felt untouchable. I told them, as firmly and kindly as I could, that this was a mess they'd chosen to clean up by themselves. That's when Lisa's demeanor shifted. Her desperation melted into something else, a painful kind of acknowledgement. For the first time, she admitted they'd made mistakes. She spoke haltingly, her voice tinged with regret. They'd indulged Megan too much, expected too little from her, and now they were reaping the consequences. It was a confession I'd never thought I'd hear, but even as she spoke, I knew it wouldn't change my decision. Their realization had come too late, and I wasn't going to let it drag me back into their chaos. Mark, however, wasn't ready to give up. He accused me of abandoning the family, of turning my back on them when they needed me most. His words were sharp, but they only reinforced my resolve. I told him, with a steady voice, that my choice wasn't about abandoning anyone. It was about saving myself. I'd spent too long sacrificing my happiness and stability for people who didn't appreciate it, and I couldn't do it anymore. The conversation ended in a tense silence. Lisa's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't say anything else. Mark looked at me like I was a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. Without another word, they turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, the chill of the night air wrapping around me. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Part of me felt a sense of closure, as if I'd finally broken free from the chains that had bound me for so long. But another part of me grieved for the family I'd lost. Not the family they'd become, but the one I'd always wished they could be. Word spread quickly among the extended family. Lisa wasted no time sharing her version of events, painting me as the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his parents in their time of need. The calls and messages started again, more relentless than ever. Aunts, uncles, and cousins took turns trying to shame me back into compliance. But I held firm. I'd made my choice, and no amount of judgment or condemnation could make me go back. As for Megan, she remained unbothered. Carol told me she was still living in her own world, oblivious to the strain she'd caused. Her social media posts continued, full of curated moments that masked the chaos beneath. It was clear she hadn't learned anything, and maybe she never would. But that wasn't my problem anymore. The final blow came a week later, when Lisa sent me a message. It was short and direct. They'd decided to cut ties with me. They couldn't understand my cruelty and indifference, and they needed to focus on saving Megan. The words stung, but they didn't break me. I'd seen this coming, and I was prepared. In the quiet that followed, I found something unexpected: peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to their demands or expectations. I could finally focus on my own life, my own goals, without the constant weight of their needs dragging me down. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed. The months that followed were a slow but steady climb toward a life I could finally call my own. For the first time in years, I was able to focus entirely on myself. No late-night calls for money, no guilt-laden requests to fix someone else's mistakes. The absence of their constant demands was like stepping into fresh air after being trapped in a smoky room. I threw myself into my career, channeling all the energy I'd once spent on Megan and my parents into my work. The results were immediate and transformative. Promotions that had always seemed just out of reach started to materialize. I took courses to expand my skills, networked with people who inspired me, and built a professional reputation that finally reflected the effort I'd been putting in for years. Beyond work, I began to rediscover parts of myself I'd neglected. I started going to the gym regularly, not just to stay healthy but because it became a form of therapy. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd pushed aside during the years when I had no time for anything outside family obligations. I even started dating again, something I hadn't realized how much I missed until I gave myself permission to try. The guilt that had haunted me for so long began to fade. At first, it lingered in the background, a quiet voice asking if I'd done the right thing. But as the weeks turned into months, that voice grew quieter, replaced by something stronger: self-respect. I'd spent too long defining my worth through sacrifice, and now I was learning to value myself for who I was, not for what I could give. Meanwhile, Megan's world seemed to shrink. Despite Lisa and Mark's best efforts, her debts continued to pile up. Carol occasionally gave me updates, though her tone grew more resigned with each call. Megan was still living in a bubble, refusing to acknowledge the reality of her situation. Her social media, once a highlight reel of extravagant escapades, became quieter and more subdued. The captions shifted from boastful to vague laments about how life wasn't fair. Even her friends began to drift away. The same people who'd once flocked to her glamorous parties and weekend getaways now seemed tired of her endless excuses and financial dependency. Carol mentioned that Megan had started leaning on some of them for loans, which only accelerated the distance growing between them. It was a pattern I recognized all too well. Lisa and Mark weren't faring much better. Their resources were stretched thin, and the stress was starting to show. Carol hinted that their relationship was under strain, with arguments breaking out over how to handle Megan's situation. Lisa's guilt and Mark's frustration seemed to clash constantly, creating a tension that even extended family had started to notice. As for me, I stayed out of it. I listened when Carol called, offered polite but non-committal responses, and focused on maintaining the boundaries I'd worked so hard to set. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the temptation to intervene tugged at me. But I reminded myself that I'd already done more than enough. Megan's choices were her own, and so were the consequences. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning. I was sitting on my balcony, sipping coffee and reading a book, when it hit me how much my life had changed. The chaos that had once defined my days was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't realized I craved. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Looking back, I realized that my decision to step away hadn't just saved me from financial ruin, it had saved my sanity. I'd spent too long trying to hold together a family dynamic that was inherently broken, sacrificing my own well-being in the process. Letting go wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It allowed me to build a life where I could thrive, not just survive. Megan's story isn't mine to tell anymore, and maybe that's the point. She'll either figure it out or she won't, but her path is hers to walk. The same goes for Lisa and Mark. I've stopped trying to fix them, and in doing so, I've found the space to fix myself. If there's one thing I've learned, it's the importance of boundaries. They're not walls to shut people out, but lines that protect the parts of yourself that matter most. Setting those boundaries wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of self-preservation. And for that, I'll never apologize. As I sat there that morning, the sun warming my face, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough.